Other ways to make selections in Photoshop, and also some more advanced things you can do with filters and other effects. And I'm going to be asking you to make a collage that contains a transparent object in it, and your collage, or your fake picture rather, I should say, can be surreal. It can be show a world that could not exist, or it could be a simulation of reality. And this is the sort of thing Photoshop designers and photographers do all the time. Is they often have a lot of photos that are not quite right, and so those photos have to be combined or changed in ways that make them functional as commercial pieces. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to put a glass into this scene and also do a couple of other things to it. So I am going to start out, as we have, by placing it. And I'm just going to paste, and this is something that will become also important in InDesign, is whether it's an embedded or a linked file. Linked is usually fine. And let's see, is it that one? No, oh, it is the Unsplash. I think it's that one. And I'm just holding down my space bar to get a preview to make sure I have the image I want, and then I'm going to place it. And it's come in. I'm going to make it just a little bit smaller, and I think I'm going to put it about there. So I have two separate images, and I'm going to turn these into something that appears like one image. You can do this very carefully and very well, but we're going to do it well enough that it would probably pass most people's scrutiny. They would not suspect it was a fake, so I'm just going to accept that there. And the first selection tool I'm going to talk about is the magic wand. And I've been focusing on the pen tool up to now because it's really important to learn that. But for this, I'm going to choose the magic wand. And often, if you have something with a white or a solidly colored background, it's often easiest to pick the background and then use that and then reverse the selection so that you have the subject selected instead. So that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to select this background, and then I'm going to go to select, and I'm going to select inverse. And now everything except this glass is selected, and maybe I will just take a look at the selection as well. And I'm going to do that by switching over to quick masks and just look at this. And we can see what is and isn't selected. And we could see that it is not quite perfect in that we have some selection that breaks into the glass. So I'm just going to switch to my paintbrush tool. Let's harden that up. And I can't see it because my space cap lock was on. And I think I do want it big. So, and I want to reverse my colors. I want the white to be on top, because I want to increase the selection. So let's just do that. I don't have full opacity, so let's make that 100%. Now there are times like this when you want a selection like this that you can come back to over and over again, and if that's the case, this can be saved as what's called a alpha channel that can be loaded anytime. But for us right now, this is quick mask is essentially a temporary alpha channel, but if you wanted to keep it permanently, you could. Okay, so now I like that, so I'm just going to click out of that so it's a selection again. And now let's just create a mask out of that selection, and the rest of the room disappears, or the rest of the background disappears, and we have the glass in the foreground. And let's just zoom out. So I just hit Command or Control 0 to zoom out, and maybe I'll just move this over. And Photoshop is smart enough to move the mask along with the selection. Sometimes it makes other mistakes when you're doing that, but usually, for most purposes, it does that just fine. Now, the trouble is that we have this glass, and we know it's a glass, we know it's transparent, but we can't see the room through it because it is being blocked out. So, the nature of alpha channels is that, or layer mask rather, is that they are working the way that black conceals the image and white reveals the image, but levels of gray reveal it in greater or lesser opacity. So I can select this mask and I could go back to my brush tool and I could select a gray and I could start painting the background into this. The trouble is, if I make a mistake, I'm going to go out of it. So one fix to that, let's undo that, undo both of those, is I could change my blending mode of my brush to multiply or darken. They're close to the same thing. And I could start to paint in. But the trouble is, the darken, it's not going to affect the edge, because it can't get darker than already black, but I'm starting to get a fairly unnatural look in there. But that is one way that people sometimes approach these. So I'm going to undo that a bunch of times. And instead, I'm going to go into levels. And I demonstrated levels in an earlier week. But I'm going to apply levels to the mask. And so let's go adjustments, levels. And you'll note some of those were darkened out because layer masks are just black and white and gray. So this we're seeing is all black and white and gray. There's a lot of data. This is sort of the black end of this. And you could think of this as kind of a bar chart showing how data is distributed across an image. And if it was more of a full range image like this, you would see that distribution all the way across. But because that's just a channel with just black and white, so all my data is at the black end and all my data is at the white end. So what I want to do is I want to take my white end and I am going to just slowly, oops, didn't grab it, darken the light end up. Basically, I'm saying put the lightest area of that channel, and this would work with an image too, put the lightest area of it at this percentage of gray, whatever that is. And so that's looking pretty natural to me through that glass, about as much as I think we'd see. But so we're getting a sense of both the glass and the background. So I'm going to say okay to that, except in the case of where the water is. So this glass is transparent, and it's affecting how you see what's behind it in a couple of ways, or how you would see what was behind it in a couple of ways, but probably not where this exaggerated fake splash is. And you see a lot of these sort of fake splashes in stock images. And both of these stock images, by the way, came from a site called Unsplash, and that and another one, Pixabay, are listed on the handout, and they're both fairly good sources of free stock. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay in this channel, and I'm still in my brush tool, but I'm going to switch to my default colors, just the black and white, by hitting my D button, and then I'm going to just change their order again so the black's on top. And I think where the water is, oh no, I mean I want the white on top because I'm really erasing. And I just used my X button to do that from my keyboard. And so I want the splash itself, I think, to be a little bit more opaque. We just did the opposite of what I want. So what I did was I hit my option button so that we could see the mask, and I did not get what I wanted. So I also probably want to soften the brush up a little bit. So I guess I'm going to live with that for now. So the other thing that would happen, and this is called refraction, is we would start to see some distortion in how the objects behave behind the water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my pen tool just to select what you would see through the glass. And this is sort of a logical place for pen tool. And I think I'm just going to select the bowl. Okay, and maybe I'll just save that path as well. So there are two things you could do. We are working directly on this photograph, so I could come in, and this is not a placed image, so I could come in and I can paint on it if I want, or do anything else to it. But it often makes sense to work in non-destructively. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a selection, and then I'm going to jump what we see behind to a new layer with just Command or Control J. And so now it is its own layer, and it doesn't look any different because we haven't done anything different to it yet, but we have that percentage of the glass on its own layer. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to, there are a couple of approaches. One could first transform it. So I just hit Command or Control T for transform, and that if you right click or hold your control button, you can see a drop down menu of all the things you could do to it. You can rotate it, you could scale it, you can skew it, and different stuff. But I'm going to choose the mesh tool up here. And this gives you, and this used to be a little bit easier to see, but it gives you the way to move on a couple of points things inside of that shape, so it gets a sense of as if this is transforming. But I think what I'm going to use instead of that is I am going to use Liquify. So that's one of Photoshop's most powerful filters. And it's actually its own little world, and we're only looking at that because that's what you see in Liquify. And let's get everything onto my screen area. And Liquify, the fashion magazines, advertisers are very dependent on that. It's used a lot to make people, well, frankly, look sexier, to make them look skinnier, to make them look more voluptuous or whatever. It's also used on faces. This is a relatively recent addition to Liquify, is all these sort of facial specific settings. So that you can change the proportions of the face, and there are other things you could do as well. It's really focused on that. It also has a couple of tools that's going to help us. Probably the one people use most is this one for just shoving stuff around. And there's also a bloat tool, and or they call it pucker, and a bloat tool, and you can use that to get something sort of like the effect that we were trying to get with that other tool. Maybe I'll just add a little to there. And there's also a twirl tool. I don't know when you would use that. And there are also a couple of ways of freezing part of this image so it doesn't get manipulated. So for example, I could put essentially a mask on this and then go back to this, and I can't manipulate that anymore because it's masked off. And there's also a restore tool, and we could undo some of this. Oh, that's the wrong tool, but there is that tool in there for fixing this up. So let's call that okay. And so now we get, that's probably a little bit exaggerated. And what's happening under the surface is that's one of, it doesn't seem like it, but it's one of Photoshop's 3D functions. It is actually making a 3D mesh. It's sort of bulging it out, puckering it in, smoothing it around, and then that mesh affects how the image gets treated. So the other thing that happened was when I liquefied it, I got a little bit of the background pulled behind the mesh. So I can solve that just by erasing this. So I'm just going to switch to my eraser tool. And because it's on its own layer, we can just get rid of that. The other thing I think I'm going to do is I am going to duplicate this glass. So I'm just going to Command J that to a new level. But I am going to switch its mode to multiply, just so it darkens up my lines a little bit. So it seems a little bit more solid, but we're still seeing it behind what we're doing. Now, we talked about some other selection tools. The one I wanted to show, I showed this one, the magic wand. The magic wand, there's just a lot of places where it's not very useful. So for example, if I clicked here, oh, I'm on the wrong layer, so let's undo that and get back on the background. If I want to select this chair, well, it selected a really tiny, just like one little pixel, or sometimes it picked a few pixels. And that's because this is not a solid color. This chair is textured, and so there's a lot of different patterns in it. And so it takes some doing to use this to select that chair. But let's deselect that. But behind the magic wand is the quick selection tool. And the quick selection tool, when we come up here, allows us to select the subject. There are a lot of photos where that doesn't work particularly well either. So let's just try that, select subject. You can see, and it didn't select the chair. It sort of made a guess of what the subject is. So that's a tool. If there's a clear subject and background, sometimes that works, or it could be a start of a selection that you can use Quick Mask to refine. But this is not a case where that's going to work really well. So let's deselect all that again. And instead, I'm just going to paint my selection. And this is just a little bit more sophisticated for picking out this part of the chair. That can be, it doesn't always work perfectly either, but it works better for a lot of things than Magic Wand and some of these other tools. So now that I have this selected, I think what I will do is I'm going to modify it. I'm just going to go down to Image, Adjustments, and I'm going to select Hue Saturation. And here is Hue Saturation. We're working in RGB, so for me it's a little bit intuitive, but I think I'm going to make it to a little bit of an orange one. Now saturation is just how much color it is. We can move it, make it super saturated or practically down to, well, all the way down to black and white. I think I'm going to keep the saturation roughly where it is, but I am going to increase the lightness. I want that chair to be just a little bit lighter. Maybe just a little bit less saturated. Okay, and then of course there's the marquee tools for selection. Let's zoom in on the lamp. And I think I'm going to transform that as well. I'm going to say Command T, and I am just going to scale this a little bit smaller. And I will hit OK. And I'm going to deselect that. Now I have, by shrinking that, I have this gap. And there are a couple of tools for getting rid of that and making this look a little bit more seamless. The old school tool was the clone stamp. And the clone stamp lets you like collect a sample of something and start to paint it in. And that can be a tool that works pretty well. You can also use it for enhancing things. So let's say I wanted another flower on this booth. So let's just start. This is the clone engine, which I will talk about in a minute, but it's got old settings in it. So let's say I want to sample this flower and add an additional one there. I can pretty much do that. Or let's say that one and add it there. It can be a way of touching up your image as well. This, like the brush engine, the clone stamp does have an engine, so I can change the scale and the angle of what I sample. So let's just change the scale in this case to, let's make it easy to see, 300%. And I still have that same selection. Now let's just, so now I can paint, use that flower as a source to paint bigger flowers or smaller flowers or whatever I want. And there's angles and there's, so I could actually, with an angle carefully selected, I could move a flower from this stem over to that one if I wanted to. It obviously does not increase the resolution. You're sort of stuck with how the quality of this, and it looks a little bit soft as a result, but it can work. So I think I'm going to go back to the Magic Wand tool. I'm going to select that area of blue because I want to get rid of that without clone stamping it, even though I could. And I'm going to modify that selection just a little bit. And there's a couple of things you could do. You can have a border, you could smooth it, you can expand it, you can feather it. That's the one I probably use most so that you get a transition between the selection and what's around it. So whatever you're painting in doesn't connect harshly as it would to whatever it's in contact with. And this is, the one I'm going to use for this though is expand, which may not be necessary in this case, but let's be careful and make sure we just expand it a little bit to make sure we get a smooth transition. Okay, so it's just a little bit bigger. And now what I'm going to do is I am going to hit my delete button. And delete used to just delete stuff. It gave you whatever your background color was if you were on a background, and it gave you transparency if you're on an upper layer. But now it comes with a bunch of options. and including foreground, background color, black, 50% gray or white. But the one I'm going to use is content aware. And Photoshop uses artificial intelligence to guess at what would be in that missing area. So let's say OK. And I'll just deselect by clicking. And that's a pretty seamless guess at what's behind it. Sometimes Photoshop gets it wrong, and you might get like a little bit of this object in that space, and you have to go through the process a few times. But a lot of times it looks pretty good. So that's what I wanted to show for this session, except for my little masking error. And obviously we could go on with techniques that have been demonstrated earlier, like the glass could get a little bit of a shadow or that sort of thing to help make it seem rooted in the scene. But that is good enough for now. I will look forward to seeing everyone later this week.